So to understand, a lot of people, a lot of what we do in science and certainly in engineering is kind of a mystery. And they think a lot of people seem to have this concept that we go into the laboratory and we have this little plan and we kind of work through until we come up with a new idea. But really, that's not how science has really developed throughout mankind. And in fact, there's always, as long as there's been science, there's been major revolutions, and that's what really moves science forward. For instance, for thousands of years, it was thought that the world was flat and that the Earth was at the center of the universe.
Right.
Until Copernicus came along and said, well, that's not really true. And he really came up with the idea that the Earth was not in the center of the solar system, that we revolved around the sun. But that was very radical. And worse than that is it really took on the Catholic Church, who was the dominant religion in that part of Europe at that time. And in fact, he was so frightened of the Catholic Church that his great treatise that brought forward this concept he didn't allow it to be published till the year he died. Luckily, about 20 years later, Galileo was born, and Galileo was a little bit different. He was a radical, if ever there was one. And he said also, not so. And he had he developed a telescope. There's many scientific principles. In fact, he was the first one to discuss the theory of relativity, believe it or not. This is back in the 1500s. And the big part about him is he was willing to take on the church. And he didn't care that, the church didn't want him. In fact, he was actually very close friends with the Pope and got away with it until that Pope died. Another Pope came along. And of course, the great movement through Europe where the church took control. And at one point, he actually was excommunicated, but he stood strong all the way through his life. And Newton taught us everything we supposedly need to know about motion and the equations of motion and the basic physics of how the world works, until this little whippersnapper called Einstein came along and said, well, that's not really how it works. At the same time, Heisenberg came along and said, well, Einstein, that's not really how it works. And of course, those two schools of thought have not yet fully resolved their differences. So revolution, the point is a part of science. I was lucky enough that when I was a student at Princeton, I had a professor named Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn was trained in classic physics. He got his undergraduate, graduate, and his PhD degrees from Harvard in classic physics. But as a graduate student, he was required to teach a course to undergraduates. So he taught them about the history of science. And that's when he came on this whole idea that science really moves from revolution to revolution. And what Thomas taught us, Thomas Kuhn, was that first is a phase, and that is scientists developed this paradigm. Originally, it was that the Earth was flat. Well, that suddenly didn't work. To describe the motions of the planets around us took math that was so highly complicated, but if you just changed your paradigm, if you took that accepted belief and instead moved the sun to the center of the solar system and that the Earth, all of a sudden the equations got very simple and it all made great sense. So the idea is there's a current theory of how things work, and then all of a sudden you realize that theory just doesn't work anymore as you tend to use it. So what happens then is the whole foundation of that paradigm falls apart, and luckily, usually almost always, a new theory or scientific method comes along that replaces the one that doesn't work anymore. And this is how scientific discovery takes place. It's not going in and planning, careful little experiments. Those come long after you first have the revolution. And then the part that the scientists have to do is prove and strengthen it. And again, continue to test it to make sure that it fits what we want to use the science for. Remember, science is only good for what we can use it for. Otherwise, on its own, it has no purpose. And so the process of science is moving from this paradigm to the next paradigm. And that's what it's all about. And the key is that it's a replacement of a core set of beliefs. I mean, they believed that world was flat. They believed that, the Earth was the center of the universe. And that's a major task to overthrow that. And that's what got Galileo essentially excommunicated. Just to show you how this kind of works even in modern times, when I was a medical student, back in the early 1970s, there was a famous study called the Brady experiment It was called the executive monkey experiment. And what Brady did is he took a group of rhesus monkeys, and he would use them in pairs. And what would happen is every 20 seconds, they would be issued a shock. They both had switches in front of them. One, if the moment he started to feel the shock, he flipped the switch, his shock would stop. The other one could flip the switch day and night, didn't matter. He was going to get a shock. And what happened was the rhesus monkey that had the ability to turn off the shock, he died. And when they did the autopsies on them, they found they all had ulcers. And so the theory was that it was the stress of having to make the decision. Turns out it was all a bunch of bunk, that it has to do with something called the gastric tide that happens when you have a digestive, and it's just, if you picked any other timing, any other way of shocking them, the effect wouldn't have happened. But that didn't stop that from changing what people believed. So a set of beliefs came up that ulcers were common in families, that it was caused by stress. In fact, they taught us, I mean, this is what we taught in medical school in the early 1970s, that most ulcer patients had mothers that were domineering and tended to force their progeny to be overachievers, etc. And they believed that this was all a part of a psychogenic symptom, and that had to do with these striving, obsessional, and dominant figures in the family, most often the mother, but also the fathers. I mean, what a bunch of bunk. But that's what we were taught. And if you answered anything different about treatment of about ulcers, you'd fail your boards. Well, the treatment, therefore, was, you would reduce environmental stress. So you tell people to change their job, get out of their stressful job, reduce the physiologic stress, either take a lot of sedatives were given out to patients in those days, or they were told to get a divorce. And in the end, if it didn't work, what we ended up doing was removing the stomach. And probably the second or third most common operation I was taught to perform in my general surgery rotations was a gastrectomy, where you just remove the stomach, because obviously the person couldn't adjust their lifestyle. So we took out the stomach. Well, one thing that was never considered is how could that anything like bacteria could possibly be an etiology, because the science at the time was that the pH of the stomach is very acid. Its pH is less than 2, and that bacteria can't survive in a pH at 2. Well, unfortunately, that's not true. And we now know that it's a bunch of bunk. And what happened was a resident, actually, this happened in Australia, a resident called Robin Warren, who worked with a pathologist named Barry Marshall, discovered a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. I won't go through the whole story. We don't have enough time tonight, but it's a very interesting story of where nobody would believe their work. Everybody thought what they were looking at under the microscope, these little black squigglies you see down here, with that they were just contamination, and they weren't doing the science properly. But eventually, in fact, it was Warren that got Barry, got the bacteria to finally grow. And he proved that it was the bacteria that was causing it, because he drank a culture of the bacteria, and within 3 days had a rip-roaring ulcer and almost died. Yeah. So talk about revolutions. Even though here we are in 1982, they have unequivocal proof. They can't get it published because it's so contrary to, again, this prevalent belief that it has to do with stress. And here we're saying, no, it has nothing to do with stress, that it's a bacteria, and you give them antibiotics. And so even though they discovered and proved all this, and the first articles appeared in Lancet in 1982, they didn't get the Nobel Prize until 2005. So when I say revolution, I mean that even straightforward concepts with a lot of science behind them, if they go against the common belief, well, it causes a revolution. I mean, it's a major upset. So scientific paradigm, this also helps explain, and so any of you, I hear a lot of you working with various churches. I'm glad to hear the Catholic Church is more open these days. Understand that this is part of the reason we have such a challenge with something like transgender or any of these major changes in science, because the approach in these paradigms is you have this set of core beliefs. They end up causing a conflict often between science and religion. And why? Because religions are based on the idea that, yes, you have this core set of beliefs, but they should never change, that somehow they're written in a book or on a set of tablets, depends on which religion you're talking about. And whatever they are, they're, again, literally etched in stone and never should change. Whereas those of us in science, we believe that we don't have all the answers. And therefore, we accept a core set of beliefs, but that's the best we know with the tools we have today. And we believe the only way that science progresses is that we have to change. And we expect that the theories that we have today will 10 years from 20 years from now, some whippersnapper will come along and prove something was wrong and make it better. So you can understand then why religions and science sometimes have a difficulty talking about something like transgender, because their beliefs. I mean, there's no religious tome. Well, I take it back. In the Jewish culture, in the Jewish religion, there's a set of references to transgender individuals, but in all the other religions, it doesn't exist. So how can they even start to have a discussion when they believe that those core beliefs don't include being transgender? And of course, what Thomas Kuhn said is you really know when you're in the middle of a revolution, because as he said, it wouldn't be a revolution if everyone believed it. So it's important to understand that these changes are radical and they're going to cause trouble. I mean, that's just the way it is.
Hey, Kate, do you want to take questions during the talk, or do you want to wait till the end?
I'm happy to do it anyway, whichever way you want.
All right, Andromeda, do you have a question?
Yeah, the Jewish belief of transgender, is that where it says eunuchs sometimes in the Old Testament?
It's in the Talmud, I believe, and it actually describes 6 different genders.
Oh yeah.
I'm not Jewish, but a good friend of mine who was very devoutly Jewish. He swears to me that it's in the Talmud. His rabbi at one point I talked to, and he said, "Yeah, we've recognized it in the Jewish religion for a couple thousand years that there's multiple genders." I don't know why they don't talk about it more, but it is apparently there in the Talmud.
Okay. Talmud, huh?
Talmud.
Talmud. Yeah.
T-A-L-M-U-D.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm terrible at pronunciation, so bear with me.
Jewish religion doesn't
One
have
more
an
question?
Old Testament and New Testament.
Or comment?
It has one New Testament.
If I can,
So-
Was that?
one question, one comment. My name is Heather. I was raised Roman Catholic. And I have one of the core beliefs that I've come across in the Roman Catholic Church is that the soul does not have gender. It's genderless. It takes its gender from the body, which I find to be a ridiculous concept. Just kind of a comment on my church.
Yeah, and the challenge will be that that has been taught for hundreds of years by any of these religions have been around long enough now that their principles have been taught, and then they find any threat to them to be a threat to the religion itself. And so we should expect that. I mean, that's what Thomas Kuhn was trying to teach us as undergraduates at Princeton was, if you're really doing good science, you're going to upset a lot of people. It's the old business, you have to break some eggs. And because if not, you're not advancing science. And you have to understand that the natural way that religions have developed doesn't accept the idea of all this change. And you just have to work through it. I mean, that's just the way it is. And there's very little we can do to change that. And realize also, therefore, that this whole idea of gender dysphoria and its treatment is very historically recent. In fact, even though there's references to the idea of multiple genders and of transgender in various cultures that go back thousands of years, really the modern concepts all started in the early 1930s and really didn't get going in the United States until the 1950s, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And they're very revolutionary. I mean, again, how many times have you heard we've just had it published? Oh, there's only 2 genders. There's only 2 sexes. There's male and female, period. Well, that's not true. Okay. So here's the real history. So the actual public awareness of transsexualism in the United States started in the 1950s. And the really seminal event was this trans woman who was originally named George William Jorgensen. This is the famous Christine Jorgensen. She was an American GI who really absolutely had all the symptoms of being transgender. She went to Sweden and luckily got in contact with a doctor by the name of Christian Humberger, who was one of the pioneers in working with hormones. And at that time, only Danish citizens could undergo treatment for gender dysphoria because they knew it was so revolutionary that, they would have challenges with other countries. So you had to get the permission, and luckily Jorgensen got the permission of the Danish government to undergo what was called in those days a sex change operation in Copenhagen, which was one of the only clinics that was performing it at the time, and underwent a series of operations. And in 1953, she returned to the United States, and of course was front page news, and again started the revolution, so to speak. And who was Christian Hamburger? Well, he was a very interesting individual, an excellent physician. He was an endocrinologist who was trained at Statens Serum Institute, a famous institute, was one of the earliest pioneers in gonadotrophins. That's the chemicals in our brain that tell our body when to make estrogen or when to make progesterone or testosterone. And he was, the reason he could get involved in the research is the first actual synthetic estrogens were coming on the market. You had Eminen in 1933, ethinyl estradiol was next, and then eventually Premarin became available worldwide. But you can see, without those hormones, how could he do any research? He couldn't, adjust people's hormones. And so he was one of the first persons to actually start using, particularly in the case of trans females, because trans males were really not in the vernacular at the time, using hormones to treat it. And he developed also in concert with the surgeons, and he realized that it took a two-way approach, that hormones weren't enough, that you also had to perform surgery to get the person to feel really comfortable in their true transgender sex. And this is where probably the most important person to all of us that are trans got into the picture, and that's Harry Benjamin. And I don't know how many of you know the history of Benjamin. If you don't, look it up sometime. He's an amazing individual. I'm sorry I never got to meet him. He actually lived to be 101 years old. And so who was this Harry Benjamin? Well, he was born in 1885 in Berlin, Germany, and he got his doctorate in medicine from Tübingen, which was one of the most famous medical schools in that part in Germany in those days. And originally he was an infectious disease doctor. He was interested in the treatment of tuberculosis. And he also had this side interest. He got fascinated by the idea of hormones and sexology. And there were two famous physicians in Europe at the time, Eugen Steinitz, I'm sorry, I always mess up his name, and Magnus Hirschfeld. Now, Steinitz was very interesting. He was actually based in Austria, and he developed some of the first understanding about how hormones were tied to certain organs in the body. And he did a lot of famous experiments where he would take the testes of a male mouse and put him into a female mouse and show that the female mouse took on many of the male characteristics and vice versa, with ovaries into male mice, etc. And so he really started to shake up the idea that sex, or the changes, the physiologic effects of sex can change with the hormones, and that it's controlled by organs within our body. Hirschfeld was a really interesting character. He actually was a homosexual at the time. He was one of the early homosexuals who came out. He had a huge clinic to help deal with and try and understand homosexuality. He actually developed the term transvestite and eventually transsexualism when he realized there were people who just weren't, being dressed in the opposite sex wasn't what made them comfortable, but they needed something more. And the shame is both of these people, their work got completely destroyed. Magnus Hirschfeld got out of Germany just in time. He got word that the Nazis were coming after him, and they burned down his whole clinic. Steinitz managed to get out of Austria just as Germany took over Austria, got to Switzerland, and they gave him asylum. So both of them lived and went on to do more research, but all of their famous papers and all the work were burned by the German Nazis. So the interesting part about the Harry Benjamin story is when he got to the United States and he started to work with this doctor who supposedly has this new theory on how to treat tuberculosis, he realized the guy was a quack and he didn't have the answers, that his science was terrible. So after about a year, he got back on a boat and went back to, headed back towards Europe. Halfway across the Atlantic, World War I broke out, and being Jewish and being German, he was told that if he got off the ship in England, that he would be arrested as a possible German spy. And if he got off in Germany, he being Jewish, he would be sent to probably sent to a concentration camp. So smartly, he didn't get off the boat, and he rowed it back to the United States, where in 1915 he set up his practice. He had a huge practice, got very interested because of the former work he had done with Hirschfeld and Steinitz. And so he set up a clinic in New York City and started treating what we now call transgendered individuals. Other part of his story is he started and spent his summers in San Francisco, and there he became friends with Alfred Kinsey, of the famous Kinsey Institute and all the psychiatry of sex. And in 1948, Kinsey had a patient who was a young male who was a trans female, probably one of the earliest trans females, certainly seen by Harry. And the mother had brought her son, wanting to be a girl, to Kinsey. And Kinsey said all the psychiatry things he knew and tried to use didn't work worth a hoot. And he couldn't change this boy's perception that he was really a girl. And so he called Harry and asked Harry, would he take care of this patient? And that's how Harry got deeply involved in transgender, and where it started his whole practice. In the end, he actually has detailed records of over 1,000 patients. He became convinced that transsexualism is inborn, that it's organic, it's not something that people make up, that it's actually somehow built into your chemistry, and most important, it's what we call immutable. Once it develops, it does not change. And untreated, he said, transsexuals are constantly unhappy, but if you treat them, they're happy and productive people. And we know there are many famous transgender individuals who've developed, some of the most seminal patents in the world and whatnot, and have gone on to be very productive once they were treated. He also said it was very clear that if you took, in this case, he was treating mostly trans females, and he said if you give them estrogen, they calm down, they stop worrying about, wanting to be a girl, and everything gets very smooth. And he believed it was the first part of the treatment, and it did, as you know, has now become a standard part of the treatment. So, and he also started to treat some of the first trans males, and started to realize that testosterone was the answer for those individuals. And clearly, he said, although psychotherapy plays a role in helping the patient adjust to the changes and the pressures that society are going to deal with, it has absolutely no effect on the fact that you feel like you're in the wrong gender. So in the 1950s, of course, he was the one that founded the Society for Scientific Study of Sexuality. 1953, he published some of his first papers. The seminal text, and I have his original text because I bought it in 1966 and it saved my life. At Princeton, I had spent my whole life not understanding why I had this feeling like I didn't belong and that I really was a girl. And suddenly there was an article in the New York Times about this book published by this doctor called Harry Benjamin. I went to New York City, got a copy of it, and there he described who I was and what the treatment was. And I didn't come out at the time. There was no way to do that. But I suddenly relaxed and went on with the rest of my life, because at least I knew that there wasn't something wrong with me. It was part of who I was. In the 1970s, of course, he went on to form what ended up becoming, it was the Harry Benjamin International Gender for Dysphoria, but it actually is today is what we call WPATH, and where they set up the standards of care, which worldwide now are still the standard treatment for all trans people. And these guidelines are followed probably in over 100 countries now. Harry did something else, and if you read his book, it's in the end of his book, and he talks about that he predicted that where he was doing it in the 1960s, that we hadn't yet developed the science to really understand it. But he absolutely predicts in his book that eventually we would know enough about genetics and neurophysiology that we'd have the keys to the understanding. He said it's all about physiology. And he understood that eventually the surgery had to become a form of the treatment, and that he said the biggest challenge was going to be getting the lawyers and the politicians on board. Hello, here we are still almost 60 years later, and we're still facing the same problem. He hoped, however, that common sense would prevail and that the practical experience would take precedent over all these theoretical considerations. And let's face it, Harry was right. And to explain that, I need to get a little geeky for the next few minutes, and I apologize, but what I do in the next few minutes, and please stop me if I'm not being clear, because I'm going to pour a lot of science at you, but I'm going to try and put it as generic as I can for those who aren't, whose professions and that involve other than the kind of science I'm talking about. So we have to talk a little bit about molecular genetics, absolutely have to talk about embryology, and the key, as you will see, is cell biology. Understand also that there's an implicit bias in science, and this had a lot to do with the difficulty of getting transgender, the condition, which we call transgender today, accepted. Because you see, there was this bias, and it really came from religion. And developmental biology, as it first developed, assumed that there's this master template. And how many times have you said, well, it was God's plan, and that there's a master template, and that it makes a perfect human, a perfect female, or a perfect male? Because after all, isn't that what the Bible says? And in fact, any variation, therefore, since this is, quote, God's plan, is actually some defect or deviation or mutation, okay? So it immediately put the whole science of transgender on the back leg because, we obviously it didn't fit the magic model that everybody was supposed to fit. So therefore, it must be a deviation or a mutation. Yet when you think about it, it makes no sense. And that's what the next few minutes and a bunch of geeky science is going to show, is that every single cell, if you think about it, that comes from a human body and makes us who we are, comes from a single fertilized egg with a single sperm. And yet, with just those two elements, we get males, we get females, we get tall, we get people short, people that work best as a CEO, someone who's better at ballet dancing. And you have Mozart with one set of genes and a plumber with another. So how could, there's something much more to this than just one egg and one sperm. And that's where, of course, molecular biology. And that's when we discovered the chromosome. And here's how you know how recent the science of all of this is. The original theory of chromosome theory didn't develop until 1902. So the idea that you inherited some kind of material in that egg and that sperm that determined who you were going to be, that concept didn't even exist until 1902. Interesting that Theophilus Painter in 1923 said, oh yeah, there are these chromosomes and they clearly have something to do with it. But it's interesting, he got it wrong. He said there were 48 human chromosomes, and we now know, and it wasn't until 1956 that we realized the right number of human chromosomes was 46. So as you can see, it wasn't until 1956 that we even knew how many chromosomes counted. The big breakthrough, of course, came with the DNA double helix. You've heard of Watson and Crick. And in 1953, they discovered this molecule called DNA, which is self-replicating and carries the code. And that was the biggest breakthrough. People think the discovery of the DNA was the breakthrough. No, it was Crick who 4 years later developed what we call today the central dogma. And what he said is, DNA is actually a database. It provides instructions for the synthesis of proteins. It turns out the human body is composed of 40 different proteins, and various combinations make us who we are. And somehow, he said, this DNA carries a code that tells us how to make those 40 proteins that make who we are. And that these are the building blocks for all of our cells and regulate all of our metabolic process. So if you see the graph down the bottom, there's this self-replicating DNA that keeps reproducing itself. There's another thing you've probably heard about because of COVID and all, called messenger RNA, which is it goes and takes part of the code away from the DNA. It goes out further in the cell to what we call the mitochondria and starts making proteins. And so all of it's locked up in this little code. And in fact, it wasn't until a few years later that he suddenly realized the code involves 3 letters in a row of amino acids. And with those 3 letters, because there's 4 variations, you end up having 64 combinations. You have enough information to make all 40 proteins and also tell the cell when to turn on, turn off, and lots of other things. So it all came down to now, all of a sudden, yes, there is a code, and who we are is that little sequence. And by the way, if you take a DNA molecule in a human body and you stretch it out, it's 6 feet long in your little cell. I mean, now it's only, angstroms wide, but it's actually 6 feet long, but it's all folded up inside your cell. So there's a lot of code there, and that's who we are. And that becomes your inheritable characteristics. Any questions at that point? Okay.
If anyone online wants to ask a question, please raise your hand because I have you all muted. But
Okay.
so far, I'm intrigued, Kate. Keep going.
Okay, so let me break it down now. We now talk, and again, I have no problem if 50 years from now somebody comes back and says, "Oh, this is all garbage." And I mean, I expect this is going to change, but today, at least, the science we have tells us that there's really three elements of sexual identity. There's your anatomic sex, your gender identity, and your sexual attraction. So let's first talk about the anatomical sex. And again, we now know, finally, that there's only 46 chromosomes in the human body. And the real important pair for when it comes to sex is this one little pair that, and we show both of them down there. You can either have XX or XY. I mean, that's where the whole concept comes from of male and female. Now, as I'm going to show you, that's not the story. That's not the whole story. But at least we know this set of what we call sex chromosomes seem to have the most to do with determining whether you're male or female and various characteristics of that. And so what is your anatomical sex? Well, historically, we said, well, if you had two X chromosomes, you're a female. We then said, of course, if you have one X and one Y, well, you're a male. And that's the concept that you still hear the idiot politicians, yammering on about, which is so out of date and so out of tune with the real science. But that's where it all started, until it wasn't so. So again, here's our revolution showing up. And what we now know is we've looked at, and we can now break down the actual gene structure of these chromosomes. And what's interesting is the X chromosomes are a very rich chromosome. It has gene pairs that can code for anywhere from 800 to 1,600 different proteins. Okay, I mean, that's a lot of information. And we've got this puny little Y chromosome, which is the most deficient. It's like a mutation. Okay, it's only got 16 protein coding genes, but it's got the big what we like to call the big troublemaker, the SRY gene. And this is where the story gets really thick. The SRY gene, which usually, but not always, is on the Y chromosome, generates a process that creates a male human being. Okay. Now, what's interesting is sometimes the SRY can be missing from the Y chromosome, and sometimes the SRY gene is actually found on the X chromosome. Now, those are fairly rare. The most common, I shouldn't say normal, I shouldn't use terms like that. The most common combination is that the SRY gene is on the Y chromosome. And that's why I need to go into a little embryology. You see, every human being, after the sperm enters the egg and fertilizes the cell, up until about 6 weeks, every single human being can end up being a male or a female. So the idea that your gender or your sex is determined at the moment of fertilization is just total bullshit. I'm sorry, there's no other term for it, okay? There are things that can happen that could end up making you male or female, and it's, yes, if the SRY gene, I'll show you, it does have a determining effect, but there's so many other things that can happen. Anybody who says, oh no, it's done, it's all over once the fertilization happens, they haven't read a science book in 50 years, okay? So what happens is we have this, what we call the Wolffian system, which what we're all born with is what's called a biopotential gonad. And about week 4 or 5, there are 3 genes, and I won't go through the names of all of them in that, but they take and turn on what we call the biopotential gonad. And this the cells are starting to, divide and get bigger and form organs. And they have 2 paths they can go. That same gonad can become part of a Wolffian system, which is testes and the parts we have with male that make us a male, what we call a male. Or you can go down the Mullerian tree and become an ovary and form all the aspects of what we call a female. So how does this happen? Well, you got, again, these 3 genes that turn the system on. And then at about 6 weeks, if you have an SRY and a SOX9 gene. Now, the SOX9 gene is interesting because it's on the chromosome 17. It's not even on the sex chromosomes. So here, this idea that it's all determined by X and Y is baloney. Because if you don't have SOX9 on chromosome, none of this works, okay? So you need a whole bunch of things that bring into play more than just the X and Y chromosome. But the key is the SRY gene, because if you don't have that, you're never going to be a male. If you have that, you go down the tree that forms testes, you make testosterone, And it creates all the pathways that then end up developing male external genitalia and the internal organs, the testes, etc. What's interesting is once the male organ starts to form, it throws off a gene called SF1. And SF1 is a sneaky little character because it turns on what's called an anti-Müllerian hormone. And it's a hormone that stops the female parts from forming. So it not only forms a male, it stops the formation of a female. Okay? And you'll see why this is all important as I go later. Now, what happens on the other hand? Well, if it turns out at 6 weeks you don't have an SRY or a SOX9, then the natural path is that you'll have these two other genes called DAX1 and WNT4A, and you'll become a female. And you'll have ovaries, you'll form estrogen and form all the external genitalia. So understand, the key of this is that up until 6 weeks, you could go down either pathway, and then a couple of really key things have to happen with one of those little coded genes. And if they're there, you become a male, or you form the male organs, let's put it that way. And if they're not there, you become a female. So the natural path actually is to be a female, okay? The males are the oddballs. And so you have this, and so it was believed that that's how you get an X and a Y. The Y has the SRY, so it forms a male. If you don't have that, you become an XX, you're a female. The problem is that's not what happens. If you go and take enough people's cells and you start to break them down and look at their chromosomes, you find out that there are at least 14 viable combinations of X and Y. In fact, these are the combinations that you can have and still be a living human being. You can have 46 and an XY. And 40. The Turner syndrome is 1 in every 1,000 births of a female. Klinefelter's 1 in every 2,000 is going to have 2 X's and a Y. And I defy anybody to come up and say there's any pattern here that, oh, well, if you have a Y, you have to be a male. No, there's lots of examples here where I can show you the person outwardly looks like and has organs that look like a female and they've got a Y. Or I can show you someone who's got all X's and has all the characteristics of a male. So the idea that there's only 2 genders, this baloney that's going on in Washington, D.C. now is baloney. We know 14 different variations. And if you have a room of, a couple hundred people, there's at least 1 or 2 people in the room that have got one of these combinations. More than that, if you look at it, why can it be that all this happens? Well, each one of these I've just highlighted is a gene. If any one of those genes isn't where it's supposed to be or doesn't turn on at the right time, all this gets mixed up. Okay? If you don't have an SF1 at the right time and available, you don't turn off the Müllerian, you can end up with both male and female organs. It happens. There are individuals who have ovaries and testes, okay? Because they didn't have SF1, so it didn't turn off the Müllerian system that otherwise was going to develop. So do you see how complex the picture is and why, all this garbage that you hear is just baloney? And that's why I'm trying to give you tools so when someone wants to have a conversation, oh, no, there's just an X and a Y. No, there isn't. There's 14 different variations, and there's hundreds, it turns out, of genes that have this effect. Because so far, I've just talked about the X and Y. Actually, there's other chromosomes which control some of this. We have people who have what's called complete androgen insensitivity. They're born with female external anatomy, but internally have male organs. They have testes that may not be distended, but externally, they absolutely look normal like a female. There's what's called non-classical congenital adrenal hyperplasia. They have genitalia. You can't tell whether it's male or female. You can't tell if it's a penis or just a very, enlarged clitoris. Okay, and those undergo precocious puberty. They develop male pattern baldness, even though most of them look like females. Then there's the gonadal dysgenesis, and these are people who have an X and a Y, and they have female external sex organs and female internal sex organs, but on the outside, they're XY if you measure every one of their cells. Beyond that, we have things what are called mosaics. There are people who half their cells are XX and half their cells are XY, okay? So the whole point that I'm trying to get to is the conclusion is the idea that there are 2 sexes is overly simplistic. Yeah, sorry. And scientifically agnostic. It's not true. All right? Does everyone get that?
Yeah.
All right.
Uh,
All right. So In fact, this is out of a Scientific American article a few years ago, and this is just looking at the variations with X and Y. This is before you talk about someone with 3 X's or an X and 2 Y's. Even before you go to those variations, here is, in order to get to the somatic ones, here's all the variations you can get just of what we know about the various genes and the various combinations of X and Y. And this is only part of the picture. So those are all different human beings genetically from the standpoint of sex. Okay.
Question,
So-
comment?
so-
Do we have questions here?
Yeah, one, I know you're gonna get to it soon, but those same, after 6 weeks, the hormones that switch on, I know you're gonna get to this. 6 weeks later, those hormones are then affect the developing brain. So we've got timing differences.
Yeah, I'll show you you're right on target, because that's the next
Okay,
topic.
I've done some of this research on my own.
Good.
I love this.
All right. Well, let me confirm what you're saying. Okay.
Okay.
So now I said there were 3 aspects. The second aspect now is what we call gender identity.
Right.
Okay. And we now know, Harry Benjamin taught us, there are people who have girl brains and there are people who have boy brains. And that's it. I'm trying to make it simplistic, but that's what it comes down to. People who believe and think and act like female, well I'm calling girl, because it's not this, because if you get male and female, you start getting in the X and Y. Let's just say there's girl brains and there's boy brains. And so if there is a gender identity, it must exist someplace in the human body. It's not some nebulous thing. It must be in the cells. I mean, we know it's in the genes of the cells. And lo and behold, since 1995, we know exactly where gender identity comes from. It's called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. In papers that you may read, you'll hear about what's called the BSTC. And this is a part of the brain, and I'll show you it in just a minute. And we even know that, like most parts of the brain, it's modulated by a part of the hypothalamus, and we know that reasons the INAH3. So we know where gender identity comes from, and we even know what regulates it. And this work actually came out from Zhao and several other people in the work they did was in Sweden, and they had enough people who were treated and untreated, transgender, and people with other hormone abnormalities, and they basically started doing what you call somatic staining of the brain. And lo and behold, in the BSTC region, they found if you have a big BSTC with big fat cells and lots of them, you end up having a boy brain. If you have a very small BSTC with little tiny cells and less cells, you have a girl brain. And these populations and there's all combinations of whether you've had hormones. This thing is universally true. And the difference between the boy brain and the girl brain is so huge, you can show the effect statistically with just 10 brains. If you have transgender people mixed in there. But they now have hundreds of brains, and they've done this, and the data is overwhelming. If you have a big BST, you got a boy brain, small one, got a girl brain, all right? Trying to make that as simple as I can. And what's also interesting is that once you're in your adult body, there's some questions still that happens with children and during the formation period of young children, but clearly by the time you're an adult, you can pour whatever hormone in, anything, you will not change this BST region, because I've looked at people that have been on hormones, not on hormones, and clearly you can't change it once it forms this way. So, as you were just saying, how does this, so if you have a small BSTC, you're a girl, large one, you're a boy, and that leads us to where we are, where if your physical sex, we'll call female, is matched with a girl brain, then you're a cis female. If you're a male body with a boy brain, we call that a cis male. And of course, what happens in transgender, for reasons I'm about to just tell you, if you happen to get a female body but a boy brain, you're what we call a trans male. On the other hand, if you have a male body and a girl brain, you become what we call today a trans female. So how can this possibly happen, that we have this switching of it, okay? How can it be independent of your anatomic sex? Well, it turns out it's very easy, and all you have to do is study a little embryology. And so what happens is, as you were just saying, and I forget who it was who said it, at 6 to 12 weeks, if you have an SRY gene, you're going to develop male genitalia, okay? You're going to develop a penis and scrotum and whatnot. And at that point, at 6 to 12 weeks, your brain is just a bunch of little tiny cells. It hasn't really started to develop. And in fact, they've looked. There's no measurable activity from that area of the embryo that's going to become a brain. They've looked carefully at the surfaces. We can now code surfaces to see whether they have receptors that can see. There's no steroid receptors on those cells. So you can throw all the estrogen or progesterone or testosterone, the cell doesn't know it exists because it doesn't have a sensor yet to tell it that it exists. And it turns out, so when you go through this big, if you have a big BSTC, you're going to throw off a lot of testosterone, you're going to form all the male genitalia. If you don't, you're going to become a female. And the brain is just sitting there not knowing what it's going to do. And it turns out it's not till the third trimester that all of a sudden there's required another surge of testosterone. And this is a place that we don't have enough time to get into that detail. But at that point, the brain develops receptors that it knows whether there's testosterone or estrogen around. And it turns out that's the point when the brain's developing. And so there's no question that it's very easy to get a boy brain and a girl body because the decision as to what each becomes happens at two different times. So everyone see how that works?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So
Yes.
so the idea that you can have, they separate and become different. It's right there. It's right in the embryology. Just go look at the cells and you'll find out why that can happen. And so we don't yet fully understand why all of a sudden, say, the second surge of testosterone doesn't happen in a female. And so, she gets a girl brain because she didn't get that surge of testosterone that was going to make a big BSTC. Okay. We don't know why exactly that happens, but we know that's what it's all about. So in summary, your anatomic development of sex and your brain development occur at markedly different times. And that by the time the brain develops those receptors, the anatomic sex is already established and cannot be changed. And any disruption of this normal cascade will obviously cause a decoupling of the sex of the brain from the anatomic sex of the body. So there's no mystery about how trans people happen. We don't know some parts of the puzzle, but we know exactly why and how that happens. So again, we'll hopefully I'm getting close to the end now. I'm sorry, it's running a little long, but so sorry.
I said it's fine. We're thrilled to keep going.
Okay, so gender dysphoria occurs when you get this mismatch, where the person wakes up and says, "Gee, they don't use this terminology. They say I've got a girl brain, but my God, I've got a penis. How did that happen?" And that's what every transgender person can tell you. They've sensed that, or the reverse if you're trans male, and we know it can happen, and that's when we have what we call gender dysphoria. And again, Harry Benjamin in 1966, with 1,000 patients, absolutely proved that this happens, it's immutable, and you can't change it once it's happened. And so we also know that the treatment has to involve changing the body, because we know we can't, once that BSTC is formed, it's a big fat one or it's a skinny little one, you can't change it with hormones. So we know the treatment is that if you change the body, it works. When you try and treat sorry, that's a little Shih Tzu we have, a little character. And so that's basically how this whole gender business happens and how it gets mixed up. I'm going to spend a second on sexual attraction. Just understand that sexual attraction is an area that partly the problem with discussing homosexuality is the terminology makes no medical sense. The belief is that if you're attracted to the same sex, we call that person homosexual. If they're attracted to the opposite sex, we call them heterosexual. Excuse me one second. Let me just get one little Shih Tzu to stop. Thank you. And these terms and this is another place that transgender people just shake up both the religious world and the political world, because those terms make no sense. And here's a good example. If someone is it's societal, there's no biological description. For instance, there's no linkage between your we know there's no linkage through lots of studies between your physical sex. I mean, this goes back to Hirschfeld in the 1930s, and your sexual preference. There's just never been found that link. And a transgender person who goes through this transition teaches society how wrong that is. And here's the example. So for instance, A trans female who is attracted to a female before transition, the world calls heterosexual. The trans female goes through a transition, okay, and now has female characteristics. And now, because that same person, like I have been married to the same woman for 58 years, I'm now called a homosexual. Well, what changed? I didn't change. Okay, so it's a society perception. It has nothing to do with your sex or whatnot. And in fact, most people, if you can really get into the psychology, most people who, often their marriages separate and that for lots of different reasons, who've been married and then come out, but their actual sexual preference doesn't change. And we've never shown that any of the treatment of transgender people actually changes their preference. And that often, they were in a heterosexual relationship when in fact they were homosexual in the societal definition. And that's why it's bogus. And so actually, in this case, they've changed what we call the person and nothing's actually changed in their orientation. So the issue is, I think the best way when you read studies is they should be talking about, is the person attracted to a male physical sex or attracted to a female physical sex? And it's independent of what you have between your legs. We know that for sure. So sexual identity is not black and white. It's clearly a rich diversity of nuances that involve different physical sex, different gender identity, and different sexual preference. There are at least 3 independent components, what we call the anatomical sex or physical sex, the mental sex or gender identity, and to whom you're attracted. The way I like to summarize it is the anatomic sex is what you got between your legs. Your gender identity is what you got between your ears. And your sexual attraction is what's in your heart. Okay? So the primary problem is the inability of society to understand and accept this. Let's understand. We now know that transsexualism is actually present in 0.6% of the population, okay? That means it's less than 3 standard deviations from the mean, which means it's uncommon, but it's not rare. It's not even close to being a rare condition. The secondary problem is that society has all these crazy misconceptions about sex. Like I told you, they think there's only 2 X and Y, and then we know there's at least 14 variations of that, much less all the genetic and all the gene stuff I showed you. And again, as I talked about scientific religions, scientific progress, people just don't want to give up that old myth. They don't want to give up the old paradigm. And particularly it runs headlong into any most religious dogma. And clearly the issue that people have to understand before this will all get finally accepted is sex does not equal gender. And that neither of them are binary. So 60 years ago, now Harry published his book, 1966, almost 60 years ago. We now have 60 years of clinical research. I mean, thousands of studies. We have 6,000 peer-reviewed scientific publications. We know a safe, effective medical treatment. It involves prescribing hormones consistent with gender identity. If they're a trans male, you give them testosterone. If it's trans female, you give them estrogen, and their whole life, their whole physiology, and their whole psychology changes, and they get very comfortable and much more productive and happy human beings. In fact, I go as far as to say the failure to treat a transgender person with the correct cross-gender hormone is analogous of the failure to treat a type 1 diabetic with insulin. It's virtual malpractice. And, I don't care what some stupid politician says. In the ethics of medicine, it's malpractice to refuse to give someone the correct cross-gender hormone once you're assured that they're a transgender person. The treatment, however, we know has to be specific, and we have that all worked out. That's where WPATH has been so important. We've now even started to back off on some of the earlier hormone treatments in children because we found it wasn't always as necessary. By the way, what we call commonly the hormone blockers, the GRNH agonists and antagonists that we use to treat kids, they were never developed for this. It just turns out they work well in delaying puberty in young kids. We know no side effects other than some lowered calcium. There's no bad side effect of treating a young person at the ages we usually do, which is about the onset of puberty, with a hormone. There's just no bad side effects. And so this idea of denying it is just, it's criminal.
Who wants to develop it?
Hang on, let her finish, Heather.
Yeah, it just take a minute now. So I'd say there's a compelling need to change the treatment paradigm, and that is, we've always been worried about the transgender person. We know they're a normal variation of a human condition, but if we accept that the primary conflict is not with the transgender person, it's society's inability, I say that we got to put a lot more attention on helping society get rid of that old paradigm and accept that first premise that this is a normal variation of human beings, which we can prove scientifically. So the education of society is paramount. And I'll leave you with a final thought. You know, Harry Benjamin really was the pioneer in this area. And he mentioned that George Santayana was credited with the aphorism that those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. You know, we now have the science, we have the truth, we know what should be done, and it's just a matter of getting enough education. And so what I always remind everybody is that inside every caterpillar, there exists a butterfly, the very nature of which is not readily apparent until it shed its skin. What you see here is when my wife and I finally decided that I'd reached the point where I was going to undergo transition, and that I knew we reached the point. We got a headstone, and we actually buried it under a magnolia tree in our backyard that says William lies here. So Catherine can soar. And in 2015 is when I came out and of course got involved with Katie Couric and others. And please, my one plea is protect, support, nurture, and the caterpillars in your life. So thank you. Hopefully anybody, I can answer whatever questions you might want, and hopefully it wasn't too long.
Okay, so we do have time for, Kate, are you willing to take questions?
Sure, I'm sorry to take questions. I try to get to that part. Unfortunately, as you can see, there's a lot the trouble is we know so much nowadays. There was times this was an easy lecture years ago. This was an easy lecture. And now it's gotten to be, I need to unshare my screen, don't I?
Yes, that will help.
I just had one comment.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just need to stop share here. I got it. Okay.
Okay, so go ahead, Heather.
I mean, these puberty blockers, a lot of people don't understand they were actually developed to treat precocious puberty.
Exactly. And then later used to treat cancer. You know, they've been used to treat prostatic cancer for years.
It's like these mRNA vaccines are 20 years in development. They are not new phenomena we're talking about here.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Heather. I see Joni has a hand up. You have to unmute, Joni. I've muted you.
Unmute.
Okay, got it.
There you go.
Sorry. Am I correct in remembering that Harry Benjamin was the one who changed his mind and decided that he wasn't going to do transgender surgery anymore because of some other reason, or am I thinking of somebody else?
That's somebody else. Harry, to the day he died, was again he founded what became WPATH with his own personal money, and Harry never performed surgery. He was basically became an endocrinologist, and even though his original training was in infectious disease, but no, Harry to the day he died was adamant that the world needed to wake up. I mean, he had 1,000 patients. I mean, his records are unbelievable. He has tremendously detailed records in a time when we didn't even have the science in embryology, but he was a great clinician and spent time and effort with his patients and discovered all this. No, he's the staunchest supporter. He never changed his mind.
Thank
There
you,
was
Kate.
somebody else, though.
Oh, excuse me?
Was there somebody else that I'm thinking of?
Oh, there was a whole, they went through this whole era. Johns Hopkins had one of the first surgery
That's who I'm
clinics.
thinking of. John
And
Hopkins.
yeah, and then there was a fellow down there who was a pediatrician. God, I can't remember his name right now. I know I've forgotten it for good reason. And anyway, he is a staunch religious bigot, and he was the one that got tenured and raised hell and put an end to the clinic. The same thing happened in San Francisco. There was a hand surgeon, actually, a plastic surgeon who had specialized in hand surgery, who set up one of the first surgical clinics. And again, the medical community thought this was such radical ridiculous surgery that he eventually had to close it. So there were a lot of times that went through tough times. But understand, my partner, Bob Kimball, was one of the earliest pioneers, did some of the absolute first total hips in the world. The bishop at the Catholic Church called him one time and told him that he was going to be excommunicated from the church if he didn't stop throwing away people's hips.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I mean, true story.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you. Thank you.
So I see that, Chrissy, I know you have your hand up, and then I'll recognize Jennifer. Chrissy, you're next.
Okay, thank you. First of all, Dr. Rohr, thank you so much. Very informative. You've got quite an impressive background. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm curious about if you've paid attention to the Supreme Court case that was heard late last year, where some of the justices are reported in the media saying there was science on both sides. Did you follow that? And what were they referring to from the scientific side?
Garbage. I mean, there's no the people who presented the non-trans issue, some of them didn't even treat trans people. One of them is from where I used to practice, just north of where I practiced in San Diego at one time. And he doesn't even have any training in it. I mean, it was garbage science on the other side. I mean, but you have justices. How are they? You can see how complex it can get with genes and all that. It's over the head of, it shouldn't be decided in courts. I mean, let's face it, it's over their heads. They don't understand it. I mean, the scientists were still learning it. I'll tell you that 75% of the doctors out there don't know what I just taught you.
Yeah, yes, I understand that. Jennifer, I think you're next, and then Valerie, and then Andromeda.
And then I have one more.
Okay, we'll get to you. Okay, Jennifer's
Comment
next.
or question?
Doc,
Yes.
you made your presentation included some information about sexual attraction, that it doesn't change no matter what happens.
Well, we haven't, at least that's the current, this is an area of which there's not a lot of good hard science, but there's no evidence at the moment that giving someone hormones of cross hormones changes their sexual preference. That's what I'm saying, is that you can give someone a lot of, if they're attracted to females when they had a male body and you give them a ton of estrogen, it doesn't usually change their sexual, no one's shown that it changes their preference to who they may for societal reasons, or they may have been a closet, what society would call homosexual, because they were married to a woman when they actually were, attracted to women from the beginning. But again, they become trans female. Now they want to call them homosexual, but they didn't. They had the same preference before. I mean, there's no science that you can give someone hormones, and if that were true, you'd see clinics out there with some of these ultra-right people giving people hormones to stop, just quote, stop them from being homosexuals. They tried that. What's his name? The fellow who developed the Enigma machine. That broke the German code. He was given progesterone because he was homosexual. Okay. It was used for years in England, places to try and it never changed. You don't ever change a single person.
Alan Turing.
Turing, thank you.
I'm not done.
Right. So go ahead, Jennifer.
So basically what you're saying is I've always been gay.
Again, the definition of what's gay and ungay, science is not well developed around it. And that makes it a lot harder to do the study when you can't agree what it means to be homosexual. The term doesn't really make sense.
Indeed. I think Valerie had a comment. Am I correct? Or a question?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wait, I think so. Go ahead, Valerie. I'm not seeing you on the screen yet.
Oh, she's there. Speak up a little louder, Valerie, please.
Okay, so can you hear this?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So great presentation. Quick question. In the discussion of the embryonic state and your very good explanation of how it is possible to get a boy brain or a girl brain, that in itself seems fairly binary. And the reason that I raise this is that in my experience, I've encountered people that seem to be very, very driven to become as much of a woman as possible, as quick as possible, where others aren't as motivated, if you will. It almost just seems like there is a spectrum that that you wind up as. I understand the whole concept of male versus female is erroneous, but I'm intrigued by this embryonic state and its effect on our becoming who we are. But in itself, it seems to be binary.
Yeah, well, let me offer this. There probably are shades of gray in there. However, in the BSTC, that turns out not to be true. I mean, the overwhelming evidence from the anatomy and the studies that were done with these microscopic examinations, the difference between a large BST and a small is, I mean, I showed you pictures of them. They're dramatically, you don't need medical training to see that they're different. What I think happens where we get the gray is, remember I said like the SOX gene is over on chromosome 17. Okay. And probably it's some other chromosome. We get these kids who say, I don't want to be called either a boy or a girl. I want to be gender neutral. I think, I can't tell you this proof. This is just a guess from reading, a couple thousand papers, that out there on those other, one of the other genes on what we call the somatic chromosomes, probably that's what causes these grays, because the brain itself, we've never seen, that was what Zhao's work was all about. The first 10 brains he looked at, he said, this is unbelievable. I can see 2 different brains here. And there's never anything in between. So at least from the standpoint of the brain wiring for this about gender identity, that at least gets developed. Maybe it gets expressed. We call there's a term in genetics called variable expression, where the gene isn't fully developing all the proteins that it's keyed to make. And that causes these gray. But the fact is, shame is we don't have a scan. It would be nice. Wouldn't it be nice if we could go get your MRI scan and say, yep, you're trans female, or you're trans male. It's unfortunate we don't have that technology today. But the fact is, I think you're right. There are these other spectrums in between, but I don't think they involve a variation of the BSTC. There's nothing to suggest that in the studies. It's probably on one of those somatic chromosomes, like SOX9 or something like that.
Thank you. I think, okay, I'm going to go to Andromeda next. I think Andromeda, you had a question?
Yeah, I was thinking that was probably a birth defect, but you say that this is normal, so I feel better now. It's a normal outcome, and I have something more to say to others who might be against me now.
Yeah, I mean, there's variation. I mean, just like, there's lots of other human variations. Like I said, there's tall people, there's short people, there's people that can dance, and people who can, like me, who can't carry a tune to save their life. I mean, that's, and so it turns out in gender identity, there's same kind of spectrum.
Thanks. Wendy, I think you have a question?
Yes. Are you going to put your slides online or make them available so that we can look over that? That's an awful lot of information.
You're more than welcome to have copies of it. I think didn't I send it to Chrissy or somebody already?
You sent it to me. I think you know what, Wendy, you asked for the link late. Didn't I send them to you? Didn't I send you the slides? I thought I did.
Well, if you did, I missed it. So I'll have to go back and look.
I thought I sent you slides. I have them. I can send them.
I have put these into the public domain. Feel free to use them, parts of them. If you're going to make any changes in the science, I just suggest, you might want to check with me. I'm happy if you find a paper and, you want to see, you want to alter, but otherwise feel free. I give these out freely.
Okay. Thank you.
And Wendy, I can say that we are going to, and maybe I should let Elena say this. On our website, we are going to have a spot where we will post a link to this recording and the slides, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But feel free to download the slides. I don't know. I usually send it. Didn't I send it in both a PTX and a PSSX? So that
Yes,
it
you sent
comes
two
in,
formats.
yeah, and the reason
I only
for
distributed
PTX
one
is
of
if you
them,
want
but-
to change them, if you want to take some slides out or something, you can modify that. It's harder to modify the one in the show, the SX.
Okay, okay. All right. Heather, you had another comment?
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with Joan Roughgarden. She's an evolutionary
Absolutely.
biologist.
Fabulous biologist.
Right.
Have you read her
So
book?
Evolution's Rainbows.
Yeah, there you go. That's a book everybody
She
should
talks-
read.
She talks about transgenderism, sexual variation in not just humans, but in other species as well.
Yeah, there are
Obviously-
fish. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Obviously, because of the language, other species cannot speak to us directly, but it appears that humans are not, this isn't unique to human beings.
Oh, in fact, we're the crude example of it. There are fish with if there aren't enough male fish around, some of the females convert and actually develop male organs.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and the sex of an alligator is determined by the heat, the temperature of the nest, not by the genes.
Okay.
And you know, the platypus has something, God, I can't forget, it's
Right.
like 20 some X and Y chromosomes.
Hyena, plant kingdom,
What was that?
the plant kingdom
Oh,
also.
yes,
Yeah.
there's that
Sure.
too.
Sure.
So
Okay.
I actually did have a question. I think it was somewhat related to Valerie's question about the non-binary. Because my own experience is in our generation that nobody identified as non-binary. I mean, it was hard enough to just not be cisgender. But in Gen Z, Gen Alpha, a lot more people are identifying as non-binary. So you're just commenting, you thought that was from some of the somatic chromosomes? I mean, I would
Yeah,
conjecture anything we see.
I'm guessing. Let's be clear. I'm guessing. We don't have good science on that. It may just be a reaction to society saying, girls have to wear pink and boys have to wear blue. It may be just a societal backfire. I don't know. I have to tell you, we don't have that science to understand this new. It is a fairly new concept. I mean, it was never recognized by anybody like Harry and people like Benjamin and stuff. So I don't think we have any good science yet to understand that.
Okay, thank you. If anyone else online has questions, I can only see your question if you use the raise hand button under the reactions on your screen. I mean, I did pick up a couple of people who are actually physically raising a hand, but I can't necessarily see that unless you push the button. Does anybody else online have a question you'd like to ask? As long as we have Dr. Kate still here with us. And thank you so much, Dr. Kate, for taking our questions in addition to the excellent presentation.
Well, thank you. Let me offer that if anybody could use some help anyway along the line or looking for some papers or that, feel free to give them my email and I'd be happy to, speak with anyone about it, either by phone or over email. I'm a little busy with some other things at the moment, but I'll get to you for sure. If you send in, if there's questions you have or things you just don't want to bring up in a group, that's fine. I'm more than happy to. And often there are papers out there that can describe, if a person has a particular problem that they don't quite understand. There's over 6,000 papers now. There's pretty good science out there.
Okay, Maddie has a question.
Yeah, it kind of relates to what you just said about testing. You identified the 14 genders. Is there, I assume there's no way to test for those today, but is there any possibility that they will be able to in the future?
Actually, you can get a karyotype. It's called a karyotype. I don't know what the cost is today. It used to be a couple like $300. You can actually get a karyotype, but that only tells you how many X's and Y's you have. Okay, it doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you like the size of your BSTC. What I'm hoping is someday we can often put what's called a tag, a radioactive or a marker that will show up on an MRI or CAT scan, and you give it to the person and it goes to the part of the brain that takes up that particular substance or chemical. And hopefully, because we know they stain different with somatic stains, we know it's possible to differentiate. We just haven't developed yet, because there's just not enough trans people to, for a company to make money out of it, to be perfectly honest, having worked for a pharmaceutical company. But the fact of the matter is, hopefully there'll be a day when we can do a scan. Someone says, gee, yes, you call me a boy, but I really believe I'm a girl. And hopefully there'll be a day when we can do a scan and say, well, you're right. So, and the right treatment is done. The problem is, for the next 4 years, science is dead in this country.
Sad but true. I was just a comment here. I was recently. So Mary, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm looking in this direction.
I have heard in the past that women can be born with both.
Both genitalia.
Right. And that, how could that be to where if they just want to get rid of one, they can be able to tend to that?
The intersex individuals have a lot of variations. And yes, there are surgeons who can help the person get. The worst part is, it's one of the areas I think that is almost still criminal in the way we treat trans or intersex, in this case, intersex people, is that the family and everybody wants it right. They want that, oh my God, can't have both testes and a penis and yet be a girl. So they rush, and there's many case histories that you can read in various papers of where they go ahead and they change their genitalia, and they later realize that no, he really had a BS. He really thinks he's a girl. And why, it's the whole point is, we make the decision before we really know. The person doesn't express. Most trans people will tell you they didn't realize, and it has to do with how the different parts of your brain develop. They didn't realize that there was a difference between boys and girls, so they're 4 or 5. And so they can't tell you they're a boy or a girl because the concept doesn't exist until they're age 4 or 5. And so that's why most trans people don't feel trans until they're of age sometime between 3 and 5, it seems.
All right, thank you. The concept. What I was going to mention is I was recently at a conference where I was speaking about being transgender for life insurance underwriters, and one of the presentations was about the use of artificial intelligence in analyzing various MRIs and things like that. And talked about how the AI can detect things that even very highly trained humans weren't able to detect. And so I'm wondering, is there a possibility here in terms of measuring that BSTC using AI? Is that a possibility to get that sooner, or is the problem that there's not a good stain?
As someone who was involved in medical technology for years, what I'm going to say is probably heresy, but I think AI is way overblown as to its capabilities. If you think about the work Harry Benjamin did, how would AI have ever come up with what Harry came up with? The concept didn't exist. I mean, most of the major breakthroughs in the world in science involve concepts or ideas that didn't exist. But AI is just copying a bunch of other ideas. It just puts them together. I developed actually one of my earliest patents that I actually sold to a company, involved being able to look at, first of all, I made some of the first 3Ds. It was called a GE 9800 in that time. And I developed the ability to look at 3D models of different organs or bones or anything in the human body with this technology. And I can not only present it 3D, but I could take like a scan of a lung. In those days, it was mostly CAT scan. That was the 9800 was a CAT scanner. And I could code for different kinds of tissue density and water content and such. And I could highlight areas that were highly suspicious for cancer, let's say, or COPD. And I mean, it really lit up the screen. I mean, and I didn't call it AI. It was just a matter of making the device present the information in a different way. Radiologists wouldn't use it. I hate Hewlett Packard wanted to buy the concept and the technology, and they took it to a bunch of radiologists. They say, no, they look at flat black and white images, they don't look at 3D images. What is that all about? What's all this? This is a color. They look in black and white. I mean, Hewlett Packard came back and said, we love your patent, but none of them will use it. It's outside, it's a different paradigm, okay?
Mhm.
And I don't think AI is not going to jump those hurdles. I'm still struggling to understand what it's going to do because so far, at least some of the AI stuff I've worked with is terrible when it comes to medical diagnosis. It's just atrocious.
Right. In this particular case, we know exactly what we want to measure. So I thought perhaps AI could tell the difference in size between a large BSTC and a small one.
Valerie's saying no.
But
Yeah, again, we just don't, but it's not, the technology is not going to come from AI. It's going to become from making that tissue look different, either
Okay.
under CAT scan
That's
or
the
MRI. And
Okay,
you have
thank
to
you.
change the AI, MRIs only work on polar molecules. And so a lot of these proteins that are very non-polar, and so they're not going to show up on an MRI no matter what you do, unless you can
Okay, thanks. All right, I see Valerie has her hand up, and then Sharon. So
Yes,
Valerie,
so having been a systems engineer at General Electric in MR scanners involved in design, Cynthia, the answer to your question revolves around resolution.
Val,
Basically, how small
hang on, Valerie. Hey.
can
Could you turn your camera off? Maybe your audio would be better because your audio is breaking up. Just turn your camera off while you're talking, and I think we'll hear you better.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, how about that?
Well, it says you've got low bandwidth.
I worked at General
We got to
Electric
say.
in MR. I was just,
Valerie, you talking about the fact the resolution is so low.
how's it going? Is it good?
It's still breaking up a little bit, but we can hear you, and so please go ahead.
With higher field strength all the way up to.
Yeah, I've worked personally. I was actually on the dean's committee.
Is this okay now?
Yes.
It's a little better. Go ahead, Val.
Okay,
Valerie,
so
go ahead.
Just as an example, when you look at football players with the concussion injuries that they have, MR can't see it. It's not until you conduct a brain dissection and you actually look on slides that you can actually see that damage. I suspect what is being discussed here is of the same order. So unfortunately, unless we all submitted to a brain biopsy, I don't see how this could be detected, and certainly not AI. I was involved in AI just as I left the organization, and it's useful for some things. It speeds up some scans, but it's not going to play a role in this.
I totally agree with you. And I've worked with up to a 10 Gauss magnet. I've worked with some of the highest, some of the largest magnets. And yeah, we can see functional MRI is an exciting field, but I watched carefully, and there's nothing around the area of the hypothalamus and that we can see any differently.
Okay. Sharon, you had a question?
Yeah, you alluded to your engineering background and just a moment ago, and with amputees, this was on 60 Minutes a while back, where a climber in New England had his leg amputated, and because of the way he discovered that if you could reconnect nerve endings to an artificial limb. And were you involved in any of this because you were working on something similar?
Yeah, no, I wasn't directly involved in that. I was involved in a lot of development. One of the divisions I was responsible for in J&J was also the neuro division. And we were doing a lot of interesting research, but mostly directly in the brain. The problem with peripheral nerves, they heal, they form a little stump. And if that little stump, for reasons we don't know, forms in a certain way, it becomes extremely painful. And to try and attach anything to it, you risk the problem of there's a process called Wallerian degeneration, and either it scars off at the end, or else what's called the myelin on the outside dies all back, and so the nerve is functionless. Basically, it operates so slowly once you lose the myelin. So there's a lot of hurdles to do, but they are doing some. The amazing things are these chips that they're using to have people sense sound who are deaf, where they plant this chip and connect it electronically. We actually developed, my group in Switzerland developed a implantable pressure device that you actually can be in a person's brain for 100 years. It's made of borosilicate glass, so it's water impermeable. If you put regular glass inside water, it'll leak in 50 years or whatever. You'll get moisture through it without any problem. But we actually developed a computer that can measure your heart rate, your CSF pressure, your respiration rate, all by measuring the pressure in your cerebral spinal fluid. And the trouble was, how do you power the computer? And we used Professor Neukom in Switzerland developed what's called passive absorptive telemetry. It's the same technology used that causes those tags where if they're not taken off and you go through the scanner, it beeps at you. Well, that same technology can be used to power a computer inside the brain. So there's a lot of stuff coming that's going to be very interesting, but we're not yet at the point where we can fully, attack, the old Buck Rogers movie where guy goes in and gets arm chopped off, but he can put a new arm on and keep going. We're not there yet.
Okay, other questions? I do want to make a quick comment with regard to the sexual attraction part of your. For my own self, I do believe that since I've started taking hormones, I have found men more attractive. I would always class myself as bisexual, but I was sort of a non-practicing bisexual before, and now I'm definitely leaning toward androphilic.
I would say it's an area ripe for research. There's not a lot of good literature. And, I think part of the problem was the gay community for a long time thought that they were, quote, different. And yet we know that, sexual attraction is different, but we don't know. And I'm sure it's going to be like we found out for trans people, that it's some part of the brain that's just chemically or, electronically wired differently. And no gay person is subtle about the fact that they like someone of the same sex. I mean, and they're very set on it. And that's got to be, just like Harry said with transgender, it's got to be something in the physiology of the brain. But remember, the gay community fought this for years because they didn't want to be called different. So research was really squelched.
Okay. Anyone else? Here or online, looking for hands. All right, Kate, thank you so very much. This presentation was very enlightening. And I mean, I'd even seen it before, and there's so much that I didn't remember. Like, oh gosh, I forgot that part. So I was very happy to see it again. So thank you very much. We greatly appreciate the gift you've given us of this information. And I certainly hope that everybody here who has heard this information tonight is going to evangelize and tell other people that we actually do know a lot that people think is not known. So
yeah,
okay.
Just remember, 60 years of research. I can't tell you how many tens of thousands of patients in various research studies and 6,000 peer review articles. This is established science, despite all the BS you hear from all the clowns out there and that are politicians and whatnot.
All right. Thank you very much, Kate. Let's have a big hand.
My pleasure. Thank you.